Hi, welcome to another Typology interview. We have Dario Nardi, Dr. Dario Nardi. How's it going?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks a lot for coming. It's really great to have you. I'm so interested in all your work. And it's really great to actually have like real scientific, like not fake scientific stuff coming to the field. And you've been doing that for over 10 years now, I guess, the science part of
Yeah.
typology.
I started in 2006 gathering data, but I wouldn't say I've done it really in a very systematic way until, maybe like the past 7 years or so.
Right. And then you have like a really rich history full of credentials. Maybe we can go through that really quickly. I don't want to take up too much time, but um, on credentials, but yeah, just to get everybody up to speed. So like you have several books out. You have a publishing company. You did a bachelor's, I guess, in aeronautical engineering. For some reason you were an anthropology professor.
Mhm.
Um, you have a doctor in systems science, right? That's your doctorate, and that's what you're teaching
Yes.
most of the time still, I guess, today?
In practice, when I was in anthropology and computing, I taught computer modeling and simulation of
Right.
social systems and research methods and all sort of like high level stuff. So ultimately, even though my background was in anthropology, it made sense because I was like the only computer oriented guy.
Right.
And I don't actually teach regularly now. I've been really
Oh, nice.
busy with travel and consulting.
Yeah.
I do have interns though regularly from UCLA. I have 3 students right now,
Oh,
and
nice.
it's always wonderful to have smart university students is helping with research and
Yeah.
yeah.
And then on top of it all, you're also a tabletop gamer and game designer. Uh,
Yes,
and
yeah.
then, and then also you speak Japanese, I saw. So,
日本語できる。
okay, right. I can't answer you, but
大丈夫。
awesome.
Yes, yeah.
I don't know if I glossed over anything. Um,
Yeah, no,
yeah.
that was all good. I mean, I would say the important thing I would add in regards to type is, I mean, like a lot of people, I was introduced informally by friends in maybe 91 or 92. And
Okay.
then
Yeah.
I went through the Myers-Briggs like certification program in 94.
Was this before or
And
after your bachelor's?
oh, that was after my bachelor's.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, is I was like in graduate school and sort of trying to figure out exactly what I was going to do,
Yeah.
and so I really have to credit, what was a huge community at the time because there wasn't really a functioning World Wide Web in the mid '90s. I mean, when people wanted to do type, they would go to a conference or they
Right.
would be part of maybe online listserv or something.
Right.
Um, and so I really have to credit Linda Behrens and so many other folks who are really, not part of the, I would say like the internet mind, repository, but people like Roger Pearman, Eve DeLunas, Dick Thompson. There are many others who have been part of type since the 70s and really did so much work to try and push beyond just MBTI.
Right. Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then when did you start getting the idea to start hooking people up to EEGs and seeing a correlation with type?
Well, I have to thank my colleague Catherine Hirsch in maybe 2001, and she suggested somebody should do something with neuroscience and type.
Yeah.
And I remembered and she sort of looked at me, and 5 years later, I got some grant money, and I had to spend it on teaching or research. So that sort of went toward it. And there was actually a gal, Martha Alcock, at University of Chicago in the '90s, who was doing EEG and type, but she died of cancer
Oh,
before she could do anything significant.
did she
Yeah.
have any results or research that you went through?
She did. I believe she published one paper, and it was just looking at the MBTI sort of preference
Oh,
dimensions
okay. Yeah.
and in a very standardized frequency bands versus amplitude and comparison. But what's interesting is in her individual notes, she did notice things like the quote, like, Christmas tree pattern for ENFP and stuff like
Right.
that. She
For
didn't
any,
call it
yeah.
that, but that it was nice to see already with somebody else, was starting.
Very
Yeah.
interesting. Okay, and now one thing I really want to dive into, and I know it's not like a yes or no answer or a simple answer, is it might take the whole interview and even more, is like how much of a correlation is there between EEG and cognitive functions? And is it maybe more beneficial to throw out cognitive functions and just go entirely EEG for typing people? And
So, what's funny? So in San Diego, I just gave a talk on this very question
okay,
to the type group there. And we look specifically at ENFPs, and there's like 37 ENFPs in the study because they like to do brain imaging. So
right.
it's yeah. And what's really interesting is, sure, type is a big component, but I think we would all actually be shocked and maybe even a little concerned if your type just determined your brain or something, at least
Right.
at the 16 types level. And I would say like career or career area has a huge impact. I mean, I originally worked with college students in part that's, sort of like made sure that that wasn't a big factor. But as I looked at people 30s, 40s, 60s, whatever, the type, is one, but career is something. When people are younger, it actually turned out that sex, male and female, is a big difference. Not huge. I mean, it aligns with what we've seen elsewhere in the literature, and it disappears with age.
Oh, wow.
Which is sort of a neat thing. Cultural background.
At least in the neocortex, I guess it disappears.
Yeah. There, and I would want to stress, I could never look at one EEG, result and say, oh, this person is a man or a woman. Like, literally, like it's impossible.
Right. Yeah.
It's one of those things that only matters statistically.
Bell curve wise. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And in that sense, like, I think the only reason it's interesting is because it's sharp when people are young and it disappears by the time they're like 55 and over in terms of that cohort.
Right. Really
cool. Culture has an impact.
Oh, okay.
So we're talking about things like upbringing, sex, career. Those all impact as much or more than type does. And what I like to say is that the brain, first of all, when I do brain imaging, and of course there are other kinds of brain imaging too,
right,
that can get deeper into the brain and whatever, maybe there would be more, that's like a snapshot of the developed self. Both contextual, like the 1 hour they're with me, but there's also techniques that are widely accepted out there to look at something that's robust with repeatability.
Right.
That's the developed self. The other thing is that brain, mind, and psyche are three different things. And brain, is sort of the hardware. Mind is like the information processing level. And then psyche is in the system. So it's the person embedded within the system. Their family system, their culture system, all of that. And so Jung's functions, I mean, at least the way I look at them, is they're really at the psyche level.
Oh.
And hopefully we tend to develop the skills that meet our practical needs, like getting through our school system in America or whatever it is, but also our psychological needs. And so they're hopefully we're then going to have brain regions that are well wired and used that are going to be meeting our psychological needs. So that's where it's going to show up, which also means that as people get older, maybe we're going to see stuff that reflects their, quote, opposite type.
Yeah. I really want to touch on that too at some point. I wanted to know as well about like the hardware you use and the resolution of the number of sensors. Does that have an effect? Like, would more sensors give you more data, or you have the optimal number at the moment?
No, I would say, well, of course, more sensors with more data would be great. I think at the very beginning, had I had a unit which had 32 or 64 or whatever sensors, I personally would have been overwhelmed by so much data, because it's like as you increase the sensors, it's multiple pieces of information and the data files just explode, and I wouldn't really know what to focus on. I think it helped that I had 16 at the beginning, which I use like the industry standard cap. I use the very industry standard techniques, fast Fourier transform. But the cap I use now is more, it's the same cap, but the unit looks at 20 different regions. So it's capturing more like the center line stuff. And the resolution is 256 readings a second.
Okay.
And I think, I mean, that also is quite standard. It could be less, and still get something interesting. But I think 256 a second is great because we want to look at things like how different parts of the brain synchronize with each other.
I don't know the statistic offhand of what the frequency of the waves are, but I assume it's like less than 128 hertz. Then
yeah. So the brain generally is going from 1 up until like low 40s.
Okay, yeah. So 256 is fine. Yeah, that's fine.
Yes, yeah. And there is some research out there, and people who do stuff that's in like the 80 hertz range and even in the low 100s, but they're not even sure how the cells can produce or like handle that frequency. But it does seem to appear.
Wow.
Yeah. In fact, a lot of advances in EEG have been made still in the last 10 years even. So
256 can handle 100 hertz. It should be able to handle.
Yeah. I mean, you can always get something better, but I think 256 is really considered like a great thing. With 256, you can get up to 128, but I only go to about 45.
Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. And so you said you were doing FFT, so that means you are separating the frequencies somehow. Like, does the frequency have an indication on?
Oh, yeah. So I mean, especially for the lower frequency bands, like delta, theta, alpha, they're pretty accepted everywhere what those mean and when you're going to expect to see them. I build into my protocol opportunities like eyes closed activities for people to show like the alpha activity that would be expected. Not everybody shows that.
Right.
As you go higher, like a high beta and gamma waves, there's still like debate about where you draw the lines and so on. But I just picked stuff that was like sort of standard, typical that's out there. And yeah, I think that the whole range is interesting. I do find that people with sensing preference and or feeling preference, and certainly both, are more likely to show more alpha activity, even not when eyes closed. So there are some relationships to type.
Right. Okay. So do you see also like the 8 functions? I know it's obviously you don't see it's all in one region. It's obviously a link between regions. But are you able to pick up on all 8 functions? And are there maybe more functions, or are you able to separate them into parts, introverted and thinking together, and know that that's what's going on? Or
I haven't really quite. I don't think it's as exact as that.
Right.
What I can say is this. Let's say I don't know the person's type. And I think this is a great example, and it's not typical, but it shows where the limit is, where the margins are with it. I had a gal come in, and she was part of the San Diego type community, and she knew her type, but she didn't want to tell me. Wow. And she did her session, and of course, like, I'm getting some ideas just interacting with her.
Yeah.
And then we did the results, and I actually did some preliminary stuff right there. So, and I want to emphasize, unlike the 2011 book, which is just on a pilot study, since then a bunch at networks in the brain too now. I would say mostly networks more than anything else now. And I said, you know what? She said, what type do you think I am based on the results? And she said, because I've gone through a process and I know my type, but I've gone through this long process. And I said, well, overall statistically, because at that time I could just take the results and like match them statistically to a group, I would say this looks a lot like ESFP. Oh. And in fact, you got a lot of like auditory stuff in particular that is really, really supporting them. But I had to keep in mind also that her career was as a therapist. And so maybe that kind of training, is going to skew it in that direction. And I said, but even though it looks like ESFP, there's one piece here that just doesn't match any of the ESFPs. And I think now we have like 15 of them, something like that. Maybe there was 10 at 11 at the time. And I said, there's this one piece. And she said, well, what type does that go with? And that's this P parietal, like right parietal area. And I said, well, really common with NTs, especially like ENTP, for example. And then she told me, she sort of unwound her story, and she said, well, I identify as ENTP, and I'm a therapist. And my mother is an ESFP, and she was also a therapist. And so that really got me to think, how much of it did she necessarily copy from her mom? Keeping that she grew up with her mom. Mom is a role model, even if she doesn't get along with her mother or not, I don't know, but it's, you know, role model. They have the same career, but she's a different type.
Right.
And so where does that come in? You know, so it was a blend of a couple different things.
But like as an ESFP, so you should also see like the shadow area as well, NT, shouldn't you?
So it could have been that. But
Right.
when I have seen that with ESFPs, I still have not seen any ESFPs that have this particular like multivariable, like multi-factor analytical ability.
Mm-hmm.
That it's more, their NT stuff is more like bringing in some like abstract use of language and some like orderliness and maybe like the O1 region, so that they're paying attention to stuff like precise use of vision or
Right.
precise use of words, something like that, is they're sort of starting to do that. I hadn't seen that yet. So that's what I said. I said, it's just, you know, this is what I'm seeing,
Right.
and here's my guess. And I certainly felt from her energy, she was extroverting and perceiving preferences.
Interesting.
And so I thought that was just a very interesting story. And I want to emphasize, this is at the margins. There are lots of folks who were like very clearly, you know, most of the brain wiring is supporting their type.
Right.
And then the brain activity is like maybe 2/3 supporting their type and 1/3, you see some regions active and you're like, what's going on there? They don't have any underlying brain wiring there, and oftentimes it's related to their opposite preferences.
Right. And so I saw also that like if the brain wiring, like from your research, so if the brain wiring for your type, like you're using the same wiring over and over again, it'll actually look less active than, right? And so
Yeah.
maybe that, and then so the parts that are more active will sort of show the processes that are maybe harder for you. Is that like?
Yeah. So that's the challenge with adults. When I originally studied with college students, and the great thing is it's pretty much held up, they continue to have active the regions that also have brain wiring that are denser, because they're like still working on developing their core strengths. But when we get to people who are older, I would say, you know, mid-30s and over in particular, we start to see like some meaningful and sort of surprising divergences. The good news is that the computer can tease out both of these things in the analysis.
Nice.
And so we can say like this has high brain wiring, but it has low amplitude. It could even have low amplitude, but high frequency. Like it's very multidimensional. So that's why I say like it's a challenge to just say, you know, people with introverted intuiting have exactly like this pattern or something.
Yeah.
That said, there are some holistic patterns that are reoccurrent. I would say themes that are recurrent for the different functions. And whether we want to break them down by 4 or 8, you know, I don't know. When I just look at brain wiring, I see somewhere between 8 and 12 different sort of classic patterns.
Oh.
But then I went to Europe and I see a lot of Europeans, especially European men, had a pattern that didn't fit with any of those.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, I was also wondering about the calculations per second that you were talking about. So like, let's say you saw someone with a lot of calculations per second in NT, and then like the opposite, the SF, has less calculations per second. Would that mean they're more NT?
Well, when you mean calculations per second, you just mean like, because there's like, you know, each part of the brain has its own speed.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry for my. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, you know, I mean, there are so many different things to puzzle out.
Right.
I would say, generally speaking, when I say, or when anyone says dense brain wiring, what they really mean is that there's this coherence or synchronicity that happens between different regions. They don't need to be adjacent to each other. Underlying, at least the working theory, is that the thalamus deeper in the brain sends signals out that say, hey, you fire over here and you fire all at the same time because you're needed for this kind of context or job.
Right.
And so when those, I can see regions for the average person, their favorites are like fastest cooperating regions, say a pair of things or a trio of things, is going to be every like second, maybe second and a half. For, you know, people who are little, like teenagers, maybe half a second. And then when you get to really much older folks, like 70s, it can be 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000. And that's, and it is shocking to think some people can really have 10 thoughts in the time that somebody has one.
Right. And then there's obviously exceptions. And I heard you talk about quality versus quantity and all that. But yeah,
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
have to put that out there. So then the other thing I was also really interested in is, so like if you see like introverted intuition and then extroverted thinking, like in your case, would you also see the opposite functions like exactly in that way, that they would have introverted feeling and extroverted sensing? You would see those as well show up?
I know people so much want to know, like, what is the validity or not of the
Right.
type hierarchy. I'm still a strong believer in what Roger Pearman said once. He said, people asked him, like, what do you think in his, like, over 70 years? And he said, well, I'm confident everyone has a dominant function. And then after that, I think it depends.
Yeah.
For me, certainly when I look at my own results, I see a pretty clear pattern. I see stuff that when I look at it, whether I do like an extra session, that's a great thing about having interns, that I can be a subject, and they'll surprise me with something. I might do meditation. They might give me like a bunch of tasks to do. And I'm going to see stuff. So I've done it multiple times, and I see stuff that's a lot like me, that supports my thing. And I also see stuff that clearly supports extroverted sensing. Stuff that's around like body movement, sensation, not like internal sensation, but things like maintaining balance and, like the C4 region, emotional expression through the body, those kinds of things. And then as many like ISTJ and INTJs have actually this part of the brain here, T4, that attends to voice tone and intention, tends to be fairly active and well-wired. I don't always know what to do with that information, but
Right.
I'm aware of it. And when I look to see, well, which types have usually is the like most active and densest connections, and we're talking about FPs and ISFP and ESFP in particular.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And that's, and so it's I think some of that is a combination of, there's all these different sort of descriptions of type and the functions that are out there, and my own personal experiences, and saying, voice tone and intention, is that just like a sensory modality, or do some types really emphasize that more than others? And I would say that for FPs, particularly for SFPs, it's like a favorite resource in their toolbox. Not all of them are going to have it strongly, but it's a favorite resource.
I see. Yeah, that's interesting. The other thing I wanted to know is, like, it's just I guess maybe anecdotal, but maybe like multilingual people or people that speak a specific language, does that influence as well the patterns that are going on?
Yes, and I haven't done a ton with it, but I have observed a few cases. I always ask people what their native language is,
Right.
where they have working knowledge, and sometimes we'll do a translation activity just in lieu of one of the standard protocol items. I myself actually was a subject for in Italy for a medical doctor who was looking at translation exercises, and he had a different model than I use. Like, he was sort of vaguely familiar with type, but that wasn't his working thing. And I thought it was just fascinating as he gave me a series of translation stuff that was very easy in Japanese to much more difficult. And he could really see how my brain went from like, sort of automatic, not even thinking about it, to automatic but more brain activity, but coherent, to being like this kind of like reaching. What could it be? Oh, I don't know the word, so I'll substitute some other word, or whatever. What I found so interesting about that, and it was actually really, it felt good, is he said that actually my thinking was like super coherent compared to most people, and that when I was translating into Japanese at like the mid-level and above, that's when I actually looked like the average person.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And I thought, wow, it never, like, would it be like sometimes when people are trying to articulate something that they're reaching? Yeah, in the same way that I would be struggling in a foreign language. I mean, that I sort of know well.
Yeah, like even people who only speak one language, but it's difficult for them to form speech. So wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah, and he just meant in that, like, for the translation exercise. I'm sure, like, I'm an idiot in some other things, but it was very cool.
Also, when you see a function, can you also pick up on calmness or stress while they're using that function? And maybe that could also indicate if it's a lead function or not?
Yeah. So just recently, I had somebody come in who did a second session, and he just wanted to look at the eight functions or eight function attitudes,
Okay.
cognitive processes, whatever we want to call them. And so I had this exercise already that was about exploring each of those Jungian functions, and I put them in order. So we started. I don't remember his type preferences. I think we did like introverted or extroverted intuiting. I think it was ENTP, and then introverted thinking, and then extroverted feeling, and so on. It didn't
Oh,
matter the
wow.
exact order, but the point is we were going roughly from more preferred to less preferred. And EEG very easily can pick up on stress levels, so those would be like mid to high beta waves,
Right.
where the person goes from striving for reward to trying to avoid failure.
Uh-huh.
And it was really interesting to see, like, it took longer. He started to use like different parts of his brain. There was more beta activity. So it was, that was really cool. So I'm right now, one of the interns is working on making that into a nice like deck as a protocol to use with people. And then
Yeah.
I'd like to start using that more in the future.
Really cool.
Yeah.
So like when someone goes into that stress, is it similar? Like I might be wrong, but is it similar to like when you were struggling to translate the words? Is that like a similar process?
Well, I honestly can't say because
Okay.
the doctor there was using the NeuroSky EEG, which just has one sensor,
Oh,
and
okay.
in the prefrontal cord, like the frontal orbital area, like in here, and it has some really nice firmware in it to like what is the like ratio? I don't know if like alpha to delta waves or like theta to beta or whatever it is.
Okay.
And so that's how he was assessing it. So I couldn't say. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. The other thing, just before we go in, I wanted to talk a little bit more about personal growth and people who maybe have struggles in their lives. Like, do you look at their past life and how much they've struggled and how that affects the way they're using their brain and stuff?
Um, that's a really good question. I don't think I ever get so detailed with people. I have an
Right.
intake form. Some of them I get to know a little bit better than others. Mostly, I ask about their sort of schooling and career training and their cultural, like where they've lived and that kind of thing. I've
Right.
never asked, I mean, because it's true, like, say a person has been through like three divorces and lived on the street, is homeless, and like all of these things versus some person who just like, suburbia from A to B.
Right.
Um, and so I haven't quite asked those such personal questions. And I tend to screen out people unless they're coming as sort of paying clients
Right.
who have like they're taking psychoactive drugs, whether it's like Prozac or and not that people take Prozac that often anymore,
Right.
but
Yeah.
like antidepressants or whatever it is. Like I've had one person with Down syndrome, and that was like just a special request to do.
Yeah. That's interesting
A
too.
number, yeah. A number of people on autism spectrum, more on the like lighter side.
Right.
And there certainly is a pattern there, but that also, of course, will create some kind of different results for people.
Uh-huh. Does the
Yeah.
autism spectrum link to type a little bit or less?
My understanding and I really want to get this out for people who are watching this. There's literally like thousands of published papers, master's theses, articles, like peer-reviewed journal articles on type topics like the 16 types and autism spectrum
Right.
in the MILO database, MILO. It's part of the Center for Application of Psychological Type. There's this enormous database, so I can say yes, absolutely. There's at least a half a dozen different like structured published research studies that do show that certain types tend towards autism spectrum, and I don't think we're going to be surprised by the results either.
Okay,
Yeah.
good. Now, the other thing is, I guess it's maybe affected your earlier experience more in the data, but what about people who mistype themselves or have been mistyped and they come in and like, would that have skewed your data at the beginning? Like,
honestly, I try and take people through a process where they're clear on their type. I do tragically now, out of about 300 people, have more than a dozen who could just never land on a specific type, or I could not get them to go through the whole feedback process for whatever reason. And I have some people in organizations that also they're like half-size protocol anyway, and they never got into their full type thing, so I couldn't say.
nice.
So yes, and the way I try and get around that when I worked with the students was to really, I had them for 10 weeks and like learning about type and all of that was part of the class. But with adults, when they aren't clear about it, in fact, there's somebody even on the site who knows me, and she's been on a journey to discover her type preferences, and what was funny is her brain imaging results, and I would say this is very typical. Her experience is typical. Person is sorting between two types. They're really honestly not sure which one. It isn't like the definitions or whatever. They're just like, I really can see in both. And then we come back with their brain wiring and this and that. And I'm like, no wonder you're sorting between those two types, because your skills absolutely fall into like the stereotypical supporting skills for those two types.
Wow. Okay.
So it could be like person with feeling preference, but they've been an accountant for 20 years.
Oh, yeah.
And that kind of thing. And it's really going to skew everything. And they're like, if we could rewind and go back to when they were teenagers, maybe we'd capture it. But then other people grow up in an environment that might be like intuiting preference, but all in a sensing family. And so then that will also skew the results. So sometimes the person will be clear or not. So I try the best that I can and just hope that the sheer numbers and the effort of like pushing people through the type process will be enough.
Right. Okay. So if someone wanted to go and get typed or tested by you, like to pay for it or whatever, is there a website that they go to, or they have to come visit you, or they just buy an EEG machine and do it themselves? What's the process?
I've had a couple people buy their own EEG machine or have access to it. Particularly, I think of a couple people in Europe.
Right.
And so they went and they're just like, can you send me the protocol and I'll have someone else administer it. And then I'll send you the data file and make a report. But for the most part, either people come to Los Angeles when they're passing through to see family or whatever, I don't know, come to Disneyland, or they're in another city that I'm visiting. Like next week, I'll be in Washington, D.C. for a personality hackers conference.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah, and very nice of them to invite me. They have a great group of folks. Also, the Association of Psychological Type has a dozen different groups around the U.S. So in San Diego, Chicago, Portland, San Francisco, North Carolina, North Carolina is not a city. I don't remember exactly, Chapel Hill, something like that. And so when I'm there, then I try and offer some things. And when I'm in Europe, I do as well.
Nice.
But for the most part, either they need to catch me when I'm traveling or they come here to the U.S., and it's about $250. And they can find it at radiancehouse.com, or they can just email me, dnardi@ucla.edu.
Right. Awesome. Okay, cool. Do you have like a long waiting list too, or it's no?
No, and the interns handle them pretty quickly. So
nice.
When they do that, I would say that there's like a consistent, steady stream. But it's not a big waiting list. I've always been able to accommodate somebody.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, and I want to get more into like some of the work you're doing now, because I know you're going more into NLP and into yoga and meditation and also mind and body stuff. So like, tell me a little bit about what you're doing nowadays.
Yeah. Well, the NLP, I got interested in, I got exposed to, including Ericksonian methods back in my early 20s, in the early 90s. And I felt like I absorbed a bit of that. Then when I was at UCLA, I taught some like independent study classes, but actually it was like a regular classroom with 10 students in it who were just invited, and we would read through an NLP book. Right. Introducing NLP is by O'Connor. Is a great book and funny too at the same time. It's like it's doing NLP as you're reading the book. It's very cute. But yeah, today I'm really here's one that apparently people love Jung and they love yoga.
Yeah.
So it's been a great market to do that. And I've also, this is a book, the small one, much more limited market, but mostly shepherding these three other authors, Jason and Charles and Winter. They're much more knowledgeable than I am, but it was really, really cool. So I feel like, the body-mind practices are really fantastic. I suppose I could chalk it up to some of my own type development. And certainly I've met quite a number of ISFP practitioners.
Really?
Not that they're all that, ISTP as well, INFJ, different types, but sort of cool. All I can really say is that, the nervous system runs throughout the whole body. And 80% of the signals go upwards from the body into the brain. So I think it's certainly worth looking at what's going on in the rest of us. And there are many traditions that look at that. And there's also scientific stuff. So in Kundalini Yoga, which Jung himself gave talks on in the 30s, that a number of their techniques actually exactly match FDA-approved techniques for stimulating the parasympathetic nervous system.
Oh, okay.
So I'm like, okay, it's like grounded in some cool stuff. And the other thing that really strikes me is that, when you sort of go down to like the molecular level and then atoms and then the quantum level and then what's called the chromodynamic level below that it's all just energy. In fact, most of what they even think of matter is the quantum level. When you get down to the chromodynamics, 90% of the matter even disappears. It's just energy. And we know through Einstein, matter, energy.
Yeah.
So in a way, like you're a blob of consciousness and I'm a blob of consciousness and we're communicating right now. And everything else is just like a ghostly outline compared to that. Because I don't know what consciousness is, but we got it. Whatever it is, it could just be a combination of things. I'm not claiming it's something supernatural, but it is something that's there.
Right.
In the same way that information is there, and
information is energy. Yeah. Information is the structure of energy, I guess. Yeah. And then to work with consciousness, and I really feel like at the same time as exploring some stuff that's part of my opposite type, because a number of these practices, shamanic practices are really quite vigorous. Taxing, physically taxing. Oh. Okay. And they take a person to, not all of them, but it's not like, I'm going to pop some mushrooms or something. Not that that's bad, but that's, right.
It's not as taxing. And there's a certain, I'd like to say it's a combination of religion, psychotherapy, and bungee jumping. Uh-huh. And the bungee jumping part of it. So it certainly stretches me. Yet at the same time, I really felt like I've come to know and work more with my own dominant function. Much better. I certainly felt in my early 40s, I'm like, I pretty maxed out on introverted intuiting. In fact, in many ways, it has some severe downsides and is sort of annoying.
Very down.
And now I'm like, oh no, it's got a whole nother dimension to it that I wasn't paying attention to. And that dimension only comes out in tandem with extroverted sensing as its opposite.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's, and some, of course, some introverted feeling. And I do believe we use all of the functions where they use us to some extent.
Cool. Yeah. And so this new research that you're doing with the mind body stuff, is that also correlated to the EEG? Are you looking at results in reality? Yeah.
So the good news is I had looked at meditation since the very beginning, just as a default activity. And then since then, I've had the opportunity over the last few years, for the History Channel, a show there, I looked at Deepak Chopra's brain activity, as did 10, 15 minutes of meditation, which was really cool. He certainly has a very specific style, and it shows up on the EEG. I've done before, during, and after for DMT use to look at for meditation, to see whether they can deepen their meditative practice. What does that look like? for the most part, I mean, the answer is yes. And for the participants, it's an amazing opportunity for them to have like an experience of what it's like to go deeper. So it becomes a reference point. I did a presentation at UCLA on that and on 5-MeO DMT, just wanting to see, did it look like what more, thorough researchers are doing elsewhere in Latin America and Brazil for the most part. And that's, and I did some with yoga too. And it's actually really cool because the yoga teacher could spot in the person when they were in this relaxed state or not, just by looking at them. Whereas the EEG, I relied upon the EEG to say, well, this is happening here and they relaxed here, but this part here, they didn't relax. And she just knew. She's like, oh no, I can tell they're not relaxed.
Right.
So I thought that was really neat. And I wouldn't say it's nothing thorough. Nothing thorough is just sort of to sate my curiosity and to see if it's
for sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you seeing like long-term benefits of meditation with EEG? Are you seeing long-term benefits of, I don't know, all the other practices you were talking about, shamanism, yoga, things like that?
Well, I think that would require a lot of longitudinal work to see that. What I can say is I have been my own subject in studies over the years, and then I have students devise stuff, or I just do meditation or whatever. And it is sort of neat to see like a pattern that showed up a couple years ago only when I meditated now shows up as in my default pattern.
Oh, so like you built the wiring and then it stayed.
Yeah. And I don't know exactly when that happened or how it happened, and it's a sample size of one.
Right.
So I really couldn't say, but because I've tried to just focus on keep doing what I'm doing with a little gentle stuff.
I guess
I do believe it has an impact.
I guess it's also really hard to say that that's the source of the change as well. Yeah. Because
it could be. Yeah. We have a built-in, almost like tiny push around midlife or the equivalent to grow in a certain direction. And then each of us finds a different practice to help make that happen. So for some other person, it might be going to Landmark, for multiple weekends over several years. And Landmark is this like personal growth and like basically like, helping people grow up into being responsible adults. And that can be very transformative for people, and that's what worked. For somebody else, it could be yoga. I've seen people who come to yoga for years, and they say, oh, no, I've never, had this or that kind of special experience. So that's not it for them. It's not the thing. Right. So I do believe everybody is going to have probably different practices. I do believe that for NJ and SP types, those practices tend to be more body-mind in a sort of more rigorous way, and that for NP and SJ types, it tends to be more of like low-key daily stuff. It's a little bit different. I would say it's the difference between like microdosing versus like going for like a retreat in the Amazon. Wow. And so I think even there are some type sort of things, but I haven't gotten to a point where I feel comfortable, talking around that. Yeah, just suggestions. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really cool. Do you have anything else that maybe we glossed over before we talk about like what how to get in touch with you or how to get your books and what you want to promote a bit?
I suppose this may seem really sort of off topic, but you mentioned, I have been involved in game design for many years. Yeah. I very clearly remember the very first time at age 12, a friend of mine introduced me to Dungeons and Dragons. Yeah. And I was the same age as those kids in Stranger Things, and I too lived in suburbia in 1983 at age 13. Yeah. So the show takes me back. And I just wanted to do one thing to say, like, I did something in game design, so I was more than just a participant. But I found that the process since then, the artistic process, literally like artwork and commissioning artwork and doing some of it myself, writing fiction, not just, like rules writing, but a lot of fiction, hiring other people to do the rules writing. Yeah. And so, it's like, here's like a little anthology that I put together of short stories that I've done. And
Cool.
you know, they're all an NT's attempt at entering the NF world, I suppose. I'm
Yeah.
okay with that.
Yeah.
And I've just really enjoyed that tremendously creative process and pushing myself to go in that direction. Not just with games, because I think games are a great way to learn. I
Yeah.
loved as a teacher
Yeah.
running outdoor simulations and game type of learning. Experiential learning is a powerful way to impact people.
Yeah,
But
I
just
read something about that, that you had some cool teaching practices with going outdoors and doing some games and stuff. Yeah.
yeah, I always strive to be subversive a little bit, and I knew
Right.
experiential learning would be more powerful than the lecture learning they were getting in the other classes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So that was and I'm like, with the experiential learning, they're going to learn what they learn from the experience. I'm just facilitating,
Yeah.
and that's and the last thing I would say about that, in terms of teaching, the thing that really inspired me the most, like this moment when a student came to me, and he was a senior in philosophy and political science, and we had just done this 1 hour outdoor simulation, and he came to me and he said, "Professor, I don't mean you to take this the wrong way, but observing how everyone behaved, because like these kids steal from each other and lie and do all these things in the simulation. He's like, just observing everyone how they behave, I just realized everything I've learned in the last 4 years is wrong."
Wow.
And that so warmed my heart. Like, just, it just warmed my heart. Yeah. And then how you can graduate. And
Yeah.
then the kicker was, in following him afterwards, he eventually got into Scientology. So who
Oh,
knows?
yeah. Well, okay. Cool. Awesome. Yeah, it was a real pleasure having you here. So if people want to check out your work, there's darionardi.com. I'll put all the links in the description. There's, I guess they can go there as well if they're interested in getting the EEG. That you have your own publishing company, so they can go there or look for your name on Amazon. Is there
Yeah.
anything else that I forgot to mention?
Yeah, I would say Amazon, and just like Googling me, people are going to find
Yeah.
me pretty quickly. I would say if they want a 1 hour recap in video of like the fairly latest things, and
Right.
this is back in like fall of 2015 or 16, something like that. But and it's in Sweden, and there's a tiny bit of Swedish, but don't let people like to turn you off. That there's a Vimeo video of that, and I
Right.
will try and remember to put that in.
I actually
Yeah.
caught that. I saw it from your darionardi.com website. I think there's a
Oh,
link.
great.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Yes.
if people want to see that, yeah, it's actually
Yeah.
a really good video. Yeah. So yeah. So
And then there's thank you. Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's the Our Brains in Color book, which is meant as like a little bridge
Yeah.
while people are waiting for like a new book to come out.
Right. Yeah. It's like I saw like you did a little advertisement on Facebook for that, right? You went through it a little bit. Yeah. It looks like a really cool coffee table book to just like for people to look at
And
and
that's
all
it.
the pictures. Yeah. Awesome. Anyway, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It was so awesome talking to you, and yeah, have a good one.
Absolutely. You as well. Thank you for having me.